30 miles from the Ukraine border, 3 miles from the Polish border. So an incredibly sensitive spot for China to suddenly decide it's going to have war games. Now, they were counterterrorism exercises. They didn't really, they weren't, it wasn't war games in the sense of tanks rolling over the plain, but just the idea of having Chinese troops in a country 3 miles from NATO's borders.
The eyes of the world then, Richard, have been on the NATO summit, haven't there? There have been slip-ups from Joe Biden, that news conference, that unscripted news conference that he gave at the end of the summit. He referred to President Zelensky as President Putin. He said that his vice president was Trump and not Kamala Harris. These are one of a number of sort of high-profile fumbles that President Biden has been making, and there's been pressure from within his party for him to step down. But put this in a wider context, how closely will Presidents Xi and President Putin be watching Biden's performance? And do you think it'll make any difference to how they act?
I think it makes a huge difference. How it acts is, I think you actually have to set this in an even wider context, if you like, at the moment, where we're going from an era, sort of from the end of the Cold War, sort of the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the big powers' behaviours were quite predictable. We kind of knew what America was about. We kind of knew what Russia was about. Even when Putin was elected, we kind of knew what he was about. He was obviously, he was a nationalist. He was trying to rebuild Russia's strength, and that moved in towards this very aggressive posture he's had. But it's quite a predictably aggressive posture. What we have in China and America, both effectively the emerging superpower situation. America, the existing power; China, the emerging superpower. Is a great deal of uncertainty on both sides, and this is kind of very dangerous. We don't really know what President Xi's plans are. We don't even know how long he wants to stay in office. He's overturned the Chinese rule book for how long he wants to stay in office, and we don't know really what his long-term plans for China are, other than he obviously wants to build a strong China. We don't know, for example, whether he wants to invade Taiwan and try and retake Taiwan by force. And also, on the other side of that equation, you have an America that is very, very uncertain, and it's destabilizing for its allies and for its enemies, if you like, or its potential enemies, its rivals like China and Russia. On the one hand, at the moment, you've got President Trump, who's seen as a unpredictable force. He says very nice things about dictators sometimes, and and at other times he wants to take them on. And, he's given very mixed messaging during his first term of office about President Xi, sometimes saying, we want to take on China. He's promising if he comes to power, he wants to impose massive tariffs on Chinese goods and kind of stop the Chinese rise in its tracks by imposing economic sanctions against China. But at other times he says, well, Xi and I can get on. We're both strong men, leaders, if you like. He doesn't put it in those terms, but, we both want to run our countries and we can get on. We understand each other. So that's uncertain for China. But then President Biden is also uncertain for China. They feel they know and understand democratic presidents better than they do President Trump, because they have this institutional weight behind them, the Democratic Party. They understand where people like President Clinton came from. He was pro free trade. He was pro engagement with China. He had certain bottom lines in terms of strategy, but they feel they know they are with people like Biden. But a weakened Biden, a Biden who is increasingly possibly cognitively impaired, we don't really know. Certainly uncertain in his presentation over the next 4 years, adds a weight of uncertainty to China as well. They don't know how he'll react. They don't know if he'll even be in power in 4 years' time. They don't know whether they can take advantage of that. They might want to take advantage of that before another, Republican hawk becomes president and in some future time, or they may feel, well, President Biden is everything is so uncertain and we're unconfident, so we're going to play it safe. It creates this huge uncertainty on both sides of the America-China equation, what we're seeing in America now. And that's very destabilizing, I think, for the rest of us.
This is a very difficult question. to answer, I appreciate, because you can't see into the mind of President Xi, as you've just been outlining. But what would you surmise that China and Russia would be wanting the Democrats to do now?
China has. I mean, my interpretation, to give that a very precise answer to that, my interpretation of how China has been acting in the last 20 or 30 years, and particularly with President Xi, is that um, they do not predicate their behavior on any desired outcome. They try and influence uh, the West in very specific ways towards their policy in China, but they're not relying on that in any way at all. So they will be gaming out different consequences for what happens in the American election. I don't, I think they probably don't particularly care that much who wins the American election or what happens in the Biden mini saga about whether he actually stands or not. I think they're just gaming out those possibilities. I think, there are situations obviously where you could, if you had a very hawkish candidate on one side and a dovish candidate on the other, so they'd probably want a stable Democratic president rather than President Trump. But a weakened Democratic president that might be more unpredictable or subject to a lot of pressures from other members of his party or a Republican Congress, that lack of predictability is probably more worrying for them. So I think they kind of know where they are with Trump. I mean, he's uncertain, but they survived a Trump presidency before, so they probably think they can do that again. They'd probably prefer a less hawkish anti-China president than Trump, but they think they can survive that with Trump. Biden creates this uncertainty, but they'd rather have a stable Biden, if you like. They'd rather have the Biden of the last 4 years than what Trump is promising. But they're not going to get the Biden of the last 4 years. They're going to get the Biden of the next 4 years, and they don't like uncertainty. So it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to answer that question. But I think they're just gaming things out at the moment.
We wanted to take this opportunity, speaking to you, to look back at the last week or so from a global diplomacy point of view. And there's been a number of high-profile visits to discuss. We'll come on to Viktor Orban meeting President Xi shortly. But first, to India's Prime Minister, Modi's visit to Putin, that big hug when they met. What do you think the significance of that relationship is?
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because Russia and India are long-standing allies back to the Cold War, where sort of an alignment developed between America, Pakistan, and China on the one hand, and Russia and India on the other. India and being naturally hostile to China, they have competing systems and competing territorial claims in Asia on their long border. Russia and China at the time in the Cold War were in the 60s and 70s were at loggerheads over all sorts of issues, including borders, but also ideology. And now the world has shifted. You've got Russia and China kind of on the same side now against America. And increasingly, Modi is becoming a friend of America, particularly of Trump, a populist America, because he is, a like-minded populist leader. But India is in a sort of situation that China was in, 50 years ago, in the sense that, or maybe not 50, maybe 40 years ago, 40 years ago, when it's not really confident to take absolute sides on those issues. So China, even as it had this sort of like pro-American alignment in a way against the Soviet Union in the 70s, was also, very strong on its sort of role as a leader of the non-aligned movement, those countries that didn't sort of take sides in the Cold War between Russia and America, between the Soviet Union and America, as they put it, tried to keep all its options open. And I think India's in that stage now, right? So it's gradually shifting its position to a pro-Western position in terms of its trading relationships, its people-to-people relationships. Many more Indians traveling to Britain and America for education, many settling. That cultural realignment is taking place quite fast. But at the same time, Modi is a populist. He has a natural sympathy for strong leaders, and historically, India is still dependent because of its historical ties to the Soviet Union. Most of its arms, for example, come from the former Soviet Union or from Russia. So it has those very important relationships, and it wants to signal to people, countries in the developing world and the global south, this very important phrase now that's emerging. It wants to signal that it's not just an American stooge. It's going to sort of try and be friends with everyone, including Russia. It's not going to abandon Russia just because of Ukraine. That's a kind of important message for India's sort of medium to long term position in the world, as India also becomes a kind of more of a superpower as it wants to do. It is kind of not going to sort of it's not going to put all its eggs in one American basket. So it's a complex thing where what's going on the surface isn't necessarily the same as what's going on under the surface. But I think that's the light in which I would see that visit. You won't see the same sort of thing going on where if Modi goes to China with and meets Xi, you won't see a big bear hug there for sure.
Let's move on and talk about Viktor Orban of Hungary and his meeting with China's Xi. Now, Viktor Orban made a trip to Ukraine not too long ago, meeting President Zelensky and pushing his ideas for peace talks. They didn't go down particularly well in Ukraine. And his meeting with President Xi hasn't gone down very well in the West either, certainly with the EU. Do you think Viktor Orban is a threat or an asset to the West in going out and sort of doing this diplomacy almost on his own with these big world leaders?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I tend to be slightly less hawkish than a lot of the Europeans are. I mean, the Europeans and NATO the establishments of those organizations, they're very concerned to present a united face. I mean, that's the whole point of having groups like the EU and NATO presenting a united front. And, we are seeing, I mean, undoubtedly, the emergence of a Cold War-like situation. It's not that bad yet, but the idea of two competing blocs, one of Western-style democracies, globally, and one of non-Western style democracies, to put it most blunt, Russia, China, and countries like them, in inverted commas. That's emerging, and NATO, for example, is expressing more and more interest in the Pacific because it feels that as an alliance of Western democracies, it has a lot of common with Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, these democracies that feel threatened by China and North Korea, for example, in South Korea's case, and the thinking in the EU and NATO as well. If China is going to give diplomatic cover to Russia over Ukraine, give credence to Russian claims that the Ukraine war was provoked by the West, provoked by NATO, going to sell, machine tools and electronics to the Russian arms industry as it replenishes the tanks and weapons it's losing in Ukraine. If China's going to do that, then this is now a global clash of systems, and we in the West have to sort of show solidarity with people threatened by China, or democracies who feel they're threatened by China. So you're developing these two sides. And Viktor Orban, there are quite a number of leaders within the Western side of things who aren't very happy about that. They don't see that they don't want to get back into this world, particularly if they are populist leaders, a bit like Orban is. They don't want this sort of dualism, and so they're trying to keep, like Modi, they're trying to keep these lines of communication open. And And in particular, they see rightly, as we all do, that Ukraine is key to this. That so long as this war continues in Ukraine, that is a polarizing war. The world is taking sides in that war, and because it's seen as democracy versus strong leader politics, autocracies, or they feel they're on the wrong side of that, so they want that to go away. So people like Orban are making strong efforts to try and find a solution to the Ukraine war, but at the same time they are seeming to show weakness in that Western alliance. If you can pick off one, if China can pick off and Russia can pick off Hungary onto their side, if you like, then that's a sort of that's a hole you can pick further to try and unpick these alliances. And my view is that's not going to happen. I mean, Orban the EU is making clear that Orban is operating in his own capacity. He's not speaking for Europe. If he wants to keep lines of communication open, I think that's quite a good thing. That there should be means of communication. We aren't quite in that Cold War yet, and it can still be avoided with if things work out well, if you like, if people are sensible. People aren't being sensible at the moment, but if people are sensible, including Putin and Xi, step back from their very aggressive postures on issues like Ukraine and Taiwan in China's case, there is a hope for a slightly better outcome, and maybe having some interlocutors isn't such a bad thing. And I don't think that Hungary is such a weak point in Europe's underbelly that it's really going to undermine these collective Western institutions. So there's a lot of anger in NATO headquarters, in Hungary being a NATO member as well as an EU member, and in EU quarters about Orban doing these freelance missions. But I think they should be sensible enough to see that I don't think that Xi or Putin believe that Orban can change EU and NATO policy on his own. So I don't think they're right to think that he's somehow a fifth columnist who's going to sort of totally weaken their posture in this area.
Let's finish up by talking about something that's been going on whilst the world's attention has been on the NATO summit. China has been conducting war games in the Pacific. So what's been going on there?
Well, I think this is, war games are planned, obviously, regularly. All countries have their military exercises, their naval exercises. I do happen to think it's probably not a coincidence that two very important war games were happening on China's side during the NATO summit. This NATO summit was very clearly, obviously, mainly about Ukraine. That's the big focus at the moment. But it was giving much more attention to China than any previous NATO summit. There was this issue, as we've been discussing, how much is China now part of this duality with which we see over Ukraine, with Russia on the one side and then NATO and Western Europe and America on the other side. How much is China part of that, and how much should we be concerned about that? And the answer from NATO's point of view has been very clearly, and it has been very clearly signalled in advance, that yes, China is part of that. NATO is going to have to look at the development of worldwide alliances, not just Atlantic alliances. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was about the Atlantic. It was very specifically a response to Russia, the Second World War in Europe. That was what NATO came about as. Now it's very clear that it's going to be looking much more widely at threats to Western stability more generally, and so they for the NATO summit they invited Australia, South Korea, Japan to send representatives to the NATO summit. They made a statement about China being a threat to security in Europe, and they talked about it being a systemic threat as well. So they were looking at these very fundamental questions of China's role in the world and painting it black. China is very concerned about that. It doesn't want NATO to suddenly start saying, well, if we get into a conflict with the Philippines over the South China Sea, or even worse, Taiwan, where there is a risk of a major conflict in the next few years if China tries to retake Taiwan. We don't want NATO getting involved. I mean, it's bad enough that America are threatening to get involved, but we don't want all of NATO to get involved. That could be very dangerous. So it sent a warning shot by, a two-pronged warning shot with its war games, because there were these war games off the coast of the Philippines, with which China's having a big spat at the moment. It was saying, this is our patch, the Western Pacific is our patch, NATO, you stay out. It also, incredibly, had war games in Belarus, which has never had war games in before. Belarus is a long way from China. It's a landlocked country. Nothing to do with the Pacific, not much to do with the Atlantic either, but of course it is very much part of the Russian bloc in Europe. It's the neighbor of Ukraine, from where that attack on Kiev in 2022, the Russian forces came over the border from Belarus to invade Ukraine from the north and try and capture Kiev in 2022. So Belarus is like the outside Russia of all the non-Russian European states. It's like it's the country seen as most hostile to everything the West stands for. And of course, it has borders with not only Ukraine, but with Poland and other, former Soviet, now very much pro-Western countries, Soviet bloc countries. And these war games were 3 miles from the Polish border, 30 miles from the Ukraine border, 3 miles from the Polish border. So an incredibly sensitive spot for China to suddenly decide it's going to have war games. Now, they were counterterrorism exercises. They weren't, it wasn't war games in the sense of tanks rolling over the plain, but just the idea of having Chinese troops in a country 3 miles from NATO's borders is quite a significant statement. So that was very much President Xi saying, NATO, be careful what you wish for when you decide to take on China.